theory of the school. Now, let's be very clear about what that means. I sat down with a bunch of kids from that school over the course of an afternoon, and I asked them one very simple question, which is, what time do you wake up at night, and what time do you go to bed in the evening? Right? And every single one of them woke up somewhere around 5 o'clock in the morning, because many of them had to take 2 buses or even 3 buses to get to the school. Remember, they're coming from all over the Bronx, right? Not a single one of them went to bed before 10:30 or 11 at night. Why? Because when they got home, they had homework that lasted for 3 hours until bedtime, and when they went to bed, they were exhausted. And by the time the weekend rolled around, by the time they got out of school on Saturday afternoon, they were exhausted, and they went home and they slept all day Sunday. Right? In order to do that, to achieve at that school, they had to sacrifice. Now, that's also true of the teachers. If you're going to have kids who come in at 7 and leave at 7, you've got to have teachers who come in at 7 and leave at 7. If you're going to have kids who come in at 8 on Saturdays and leave at 1, the teacher's got to give up their Saturday as well. Not to mention July, 3 weeks in July, when every teacher would love to be off on vacation somewhere. They come to the South Bronx, to a school that just got air conditioning, right? And spend 3 weeks with those kids, giving them a head start on the school year. And those teachers give out their cell phone and their home phone numbers to all their students. Why? Because most of these students do not have parents who have enough education to help them with their homework. Right? So they have to be ready to take calls at night. That is the kind of effort that is necessary to reverse this kind of cycle of poverty and criminality and despair that has affected so many disadvantaged communities in this country. And it doesn't happen by magic. It takes a lot of effort and a lot of hard work. But think about what that school tells us. Right? It says, first of all, and most powerfully, that change really is possible. If somebody came to you and said, I can take a random sample of 5th graders from one of the poorest neighborhoods in this country, right, and move them from the 30th to the 80th percentile in 4 years of middle school, would you believe them? These are kids who are doing high school algebra in 7th grade. I'll be honest with you, I did not believe that was possible until I went to that school, but it is. And that is the first, and I think, the most critical lesson of what they're doing at that school in the Bronx. Until you believe that kids from the most impoverished of backgrounds who are living in one-bedroom apartments with their single parent, whose mom is going to work at McDonald's every morning, until you believe those kids can do high school algebra in the 7th grade if they work hard enough, it'll never happen. That kind of thing happens when you embrace the notion that this kind of change is possible, in contravention of every intuitive notion we have about how change actually comes about. Now think about how that change is framed, even more critically. No one pretends that there was any kind of magic involved in those schools. They didn't import Jaime Escalante from L.A. to teach their math classes. Right? There's no special, wonderful teachers who somehow make this experience unlike any other experience going on anywhere in America. These schools do not depend on a $50 million bequest from the Gates Foundation. Right? They spend exactly the same amount of money as every other public school in New York City. The way that change is framed is that, look, if we work together, if we work really hard together, if teachers and students create a kind of partnership, we can make something happen. That school says that if those of us in a position of privilege create an opportunity to learn, and those at the bottom seize that opportunity, then something real and beautiful and wonderful can result. That school has framed its mission as a combination of partnership and opportunity. And if you can do the same thing here in the Twin Cities, I think you can build yourself a sustainable and important future. And if you don't, well, just imagine if the Jewish immigrants and the Italian immigrants had come not to New York, but to California. And imagine that if they had come not in 1900, but in 1925, right? And if they hadn't sailed past the Statue of Liberty welcoming them, but come into a community that pretended they did not exist, pretended that they were birds of passage who would go back to their homelands as soon as the harvest was over. Right? If those two groups had come under those circumstances, what would America look like today? Thank you.
Now and again, there are calls to decriminalize drug use, and I wondered what your view of that was, and also whether or not you think that in itself is an important issue.
Well, I mean, I have many. First of all, let me say I'm not an expert on that question. And secondly, that question falls into a debate over what is the right course or the wrong course. I think that this discussion is about something slightly different, which is what is the doable course and what is the not doable course. The challenge is not. The challenge here is to figure out ways to make as many of these reforms as possible stick and win the support of as many people as possible in that state. Decriminalization, whatever merits it might have, doesn't fit those criteria. It's a really good way, I think, of alienating some of the very same people who you need on your side. I think there is a kind of middle way to do this, where we can continue to acknowledge that these kinds of some sanctions are necessary, but balance that with a much more understanding and compassionate and reasonable approach to punitive actions. I think that is the most, in the near term at least, is the most practical course. The urgency of this situation is such that I think you do need to be focused on what's practical now, as opposed to what might be, in the long term, a kind of more ideal, theoretically a more ideal course of action.
Yeah, thank you. I'd like to suggest that the criminal justice system now is more like the modern-day plantation society, where the massive amounts of peoples of color are disenfranchised politically and economically, and their labor is appropriated in the prison industries and for private prisons in order to put profit in someone's pocket. And if we concentrate only on successful reentry strategies and reducing recidivism, it's a partial solution at best. So I'd like to hear what your thoughts are on change occurring in the larger criminal justice or injustice system, and how to frame and reframe that whole issue. Thanks.
Yeah. I mean, and these questions are not easy, by the way. Well, I guess, I would go back a little bit to what I was saying before. When I was talking about the range of, if you look at, as I hope you all do, read in its entirety the Council report. It is a fascinating and important document. And when you look at the list of recommendations, you will see, as I said, that it is an extraordinarily ambitious list. And I think appropriately ambitious. And I think the people who wrote that document realized what they were doing, which was they were saying, in a perfect world, this is what we would get. But the world isn't perfect. And the issue over the next couple of years is, as I've said, which of those recommendations can we get the best support now for and move ahead with? When you look at the list, you'll see that number one on that list is education. And it's number one, I suspect, because it's the one that you can move forward with first and most easily and can win the broadest consensus for. And I think if you can start with something like that and show real progress, you can start to enlist people for the other more controversial or difficult items on that agenda. The last questioner, I'm sure you are in agreement with me that what you have said is something that would be deeply controversial to lots of people in this country and state. It's